So let me introduce Marcus Vogelbacher. He's from the University of Marburg and the research group on distributed systems and intelligent computing. And he's looking at the digital view of how animals communicate and behave. And he's particularly going to talk about bats today, but as a fact that they're a species which are very well propagated across the planet, which gives a good indicator of biodiversity, which is one of the challenges of our time. So I'm really looking forward to hearing him speak to us today. Welcome, Marcus, please.
So thank you for the kind introduction to my very first appearance at a conference. And my name is Marcus Vogelbacher from the University of Marburg, and today I'll be talking about deep learning for recognizing bat species and bat behavior in audio recordings. So you might ask yourself, why shall we monitor those tiny flying mammals? And bats are not only one of the most widespread terrestrial mammals around the globe, but they are also excellent bioindicators for ecosystem health, which is also the basis of human life. And they emit different sounds, not only for communication, but also for orientation. And monitoring them manually is a very tedious task, because the human experts need to listen to the recordings again and again, and they also need to measure the calls in spectrograms as a visual representation, and that just takes a whole lot of time. So automated methods are urgently required, and while recognizing species in the recordings is already a good thing, it would be important to also recognize behavior, since it makes a huge difference whether the bat is just passing the area that is monitored, or it's actually living there, it's hunting there, or having juveniles. So when monitoring bats manually, mostly time expansion is applied, for example, by a factor of 10, which means the audio is just stretched by a factor, and therefore the frequencies decrease by the same factor. And so we can make the ultrasonic sounds bats produce audible for humans. Otherwise, the experts would hear nothing and couldn't analyze anything. So, and on the other hand, there are different ways to feed audio into machine learning models. First of all, we could just use the raw audio file. This is very elegant and simple. However, in the literature, we often find linear spectrograms that can be produced through a short-term Fourier transform, or even mel-scale log spectrograms, which are adapted to the human perception of sounds. And last but not least, we have learnable filters, like, for example, Google's Leaf. So these approaches try to learn this transformation from the data rather than just using human-defined methods. In general, bat calls can be divided into three main classes: echolocation calls that are used for orientation during flight, feeding buzzes, which are needed for hunting, and social calls for communicating with one another. And for the species recognition, mostly echolocation calls are used, especially because they are by far the most frequent calls. And so here we have some examples. Bats do emit ultrasonic calls for orientation, so they wait for the echo to return and can then draw conclusions about their environment from it. And usually it's short pulses like these here, and they are separated by longer periods of time. So the bat does not risk to deafen itself, but can receive the echo and analyze it. And some species have a different call, though, like this one here. It's a constant frequency call, and I think it's a call of a horseshoe bat here, and they use Doppler shifts for their calls, so they are able to send and emit the call at the same time, or send the call and emit the echo at the same time. Feeding buzzes are ultrasonic as well. However, it's a fast and accelerating sequence of calls, and they're used to locate insects during hunting very precisely. And at the end of a buzz, there's an attempt to capture the target. However, we can only see this long buzz here, but we cannot see or hear in the audio whether the attempt was successful or not. Social calls actually differ quite a bit from the calls we saw before, because they are, on the one hand, often audible for humans, and on the other hand, much more complex than echolocation calls or feeding buzzes. And we also have a lot of different types of social calls, since the range of applications is also very diverse. Like we have calls for mating, for fighting, for distress, or for mother-infant interaction, for example. And this call here is a trilled social call, and that actually looks a bit like a feeding buzz and might be confused. However, it's in lower frequency ranges. So from these definitions, we have some challenges that arise. We saw different call lengths, like feeding buzzes are very long. Some echolocation calls are very short, but they should all be captured well. There were also similar calls like the trilled social call and feeding buzzes, and also in one genus there can be different species that have very similar echolocation calls, since they are closely related, and it's hard to distinguish for humans as well. And finally, we have some noises like this one here. They are produced by insects, for example, crickets, and look a bit like a feeding buzz too, actually, and this should be avoided to confuse these with feeding buzzes. So up to now, for automated bat species recognition, mostly deep learning approaches are used, but usually in a sliding window manner. So we have that sliding window, and its content is analyzed at each point in time. And the window size is fixed, and that's actually a problem if you have other calls than just echolocation calls, because this window here, the solid line, fits the call quite well, but it could never capture a feeding buzz. And if we would use a window that can capture a feeding buzz, we would have several echolocation calls in it, and they could even be of different species, so that's not beneficial for the classification. So we propose to use an object detection approach inspired from computer vision and apply it to the spectrograms, so we can generate precise call boundaries. And we use 3 classes for it, according to the behaviors I just explained: echolocation call, feeding buzz, and social call. And if we want to do species recognition, we just replaced the echolocation call class by 19 species classes, and we had bats from Northern Africa and Europe. And yeah, then we used the echolocation calls for the species recognition. So first of all, we apply a time expansion by a factor of 10 in the pre-processing step, and therefore also decrease the frequencies, so all sounds are then hearable or audible for humans, even the ultrasonic ones. And next we resample all data to 96 kilohertz, which is actually just inspired by the main data set we used. And according to the Shannon-Nyquist sampling theorem, we can now capture frequencies of up to 48 kilohertz in the time expanded domain, which would be 480 kilohertz in real-time data. And as a visual representation, we chose the MEL spectrograms, since we're in the human audible range now anyway. And furthermore, we didn't notice any significant drop in performance over using linear spectrograms. Yeah, right, and therefore we use them. So we generate our MEL spectrograms with 128 MEL bins, a window size of 23 milliseconds in the time expanded domain, and a window overlap of 84.5%. And our MEL filter banks do only consider frequencies from 500 Hertz to 17 kilohertz in the time expanded domain, because that's actually the range where we expect the beds in our test data set, or also in the training data set, to be located. And this results in spectrograms of a size of 2777 times 128 pixels for a 1 second real-time audio snippet. As our architecture, we chose a fast-R CNN, and we tried out 3 backbones, namely the ResNet 50 and the ResNext 101, both with a feature pyramid network. And we also tried a VidDet, which is a backbone based on a vision transformer that is optimized for object detection by simulating the feature pyramid network that the other networks use too, by simply upscaling or downscaling the one-sized feature map from the transformer architecture. And as we see in the figure, we just replace the natural images by the spectrograms and feed them into the backbone, which extracts the feature maps, and then the region proposals are done, and after our I-line, we can classify our bounding boxes. In our experiments, we use 2 data sets. The first one is by the Tierstimmenarchiv from Berlin, which is a huge collection of animal sounds. And the bed data we used is or was recorded on tape originally and later digitized. And it also comes with notes made by the recordist about his recordings. And based on these notes, we annotated almost 31,000 bounding boxes. And each bounding box is annotated for behavior as well as for the corresponding species. The second data set was recorded during audio exploratories in Germany with so-called audio moth devices, which can passively record for a long time, but produce recordings of worse quality. So we decided not to annotate species in here, because they would have taken a whole lot of time. So we annotated more than 4,000 bounding boxes with behavior. On the Tierstimmenarchiv data set, we achieved the following results for average precision at 50% IOU. For all models and all classes, it's clearly above 90%, which is very good. And especially the VidDet shows a good performance, in particular for the feeding buzzes. And we assume it's to the nature of a transformer network, which can recognize or perceive a more global context already in the first layers. And this might be beneficial for the very long feeding buzzes compared to CNNs. On the audio exploratories data set, this impression is confirmed. Again, all values are above 90%, and the VidDet seems to be the better or the best architecture. However, we did not evaluate this data set on feeding buzzes, since we only found 6 feeding buzzes in the entire data set, and therefore omit these in our experiments. So maybe a better explanation than those numbers is a visualization of the results. And in the upper spectrogram, all echolocation calls were captured very precisely and recognized as an echolocation call. And also the social call here in red is captured pretty well. The box is a little bit too wide, but it's still okay. And the feeding buzz in the lower image is also captured very nicely. So this about bad behavior recognition. In bad species recognition, of course, we use the TSA data set, since we don't have any other species annotations. And again, the VidDet shows the best performance with 86% compared to only 80 for the ResNet 50. And on the right, we have a confusion matrix for the VITDAT, and it shows a very nice diagonal line with only few outliers like this one here, which is nicely explainable because it's two pipistrelle bats that are confused. And they are hard to distinguish for humans as well, since they are from the same genus. And those down here are actually all from the nyctaloid group, which is also very similar in their calls. And in some works, it's even treated as non-distinguishable calls. So finally, we compare our approach to a state-of-the-art sliding window approach on the TSA dataset. And for echolocation call detection, the sliding window approach shows some issues because, since, as I explained, the sliding window has a fixed size, it cannot handle longer calls like feeding buzzes or social calls, and it will recognize many single echolocation calls in this case, and therefore it only reaches 72% average precision, while our approach performs almost perfectly with 98.8%. And for species recognition, we also outperform the sliding window approach with 86 to 80% mean average precision. In conclusion, we proposed a new novel approach for bat call recognition through object detection inspired from computer vision, and the precise detection of call boundaries enables for a better performance and classification based on the echolocation calls. It's furthermore the first approach that has been made to bat behavior recognition, and we show state-of-the-art performance for bat species recognition. In general, we reached up to 97.4% mean average precision in behavior recognition and up to 86.2% mean average precision in species recognition. For future works, it would be interesting to explore smaller architectures, since the VITDAT is very big, and it would be better to run the models on edge devices, since transferring all the data to the cloud is very expensive. Furthermore, all call types could be taken into account for species recognition, especially some social calls are very characteristic for the corresponding species. And we could also classify the social calls into the subclasses like fighting or mating or mother-infant interaction. So we could gain much more knowledge about how bats actually behave than just to say there were many social calls, which can also be helpful, but it would be better to classify them in finer classes. And last but not least, we could use self-supervised approaches, which is actually a big topic here because we have a whole lot of data, but it's all unannotated. Only very few samples are annotated since it's so tedious. And self-supervised approaches would be perfect for that. So I'm already at the end of my presentation, and thank you for your interest in my work and for your attention. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Please, this gentleman with the green. You can do it without a mic, and here we were never given a mic.
What is your most prominent background noise, your most prominent false detection?
Actually, there's not so much noise in the data since it's mostly in the ultrasonic range, and also where the sounds are recorded, there's not so much noise in general in a forest or something. And also, at least on the Tierstimmarchiv data set, it's mostly that the bats were captured and the microphone is pretty close to them. However, on the audio exploratories data set, it's probably mostly insects that are confused with feeding buzzes, or sometimes also calls, and There's also some jitter sometimes due to the microphone quality.
Thank you. Just this gentleman first, sorry.
Thanks for the talk. So two parts. One, can you distinguish between two individual bats from the same species?
That's actually something we're trying now. It's not even clear whether that's possible at all. But yeah, we try it, but we cannot now.
I guess the second half of that is, are you planning to infer from the data like how many bats there are in a region, what the distributions are like?
Yeah, it's about species, I think, especially when you, for example, want to build a wind power plant. You need to prove that certain endangered bat species don't live there, and for this purpose, it would be very helpful.
Please.
Thank you for the talk. I'm wondering if you have some difficulties at gathering the data when it comes to different hardware, like different type of microphones, different setups. If you experience difficulties on that, and how did you sort it out?
That's actually indeed a problem. Like the data distribution shift is always difficult. So here we had two data sets and have used them separately because the quality is very different. But it would definitely be something we'd like to improve in future work.
The gentleman here.
Speaking of hardware, you mentioned this audio mod device. You yourself, do you have any experience whether it works fine or not? I'm interested for another project related to laying hens.
Well, we have good experience with it in bird classification, actually. They were brought out to forests and recorded bird songs for 2 years, I think, and the data is good. I'm not so sure about bats, actually. Yeah, but it can, because we use them, it can record ultrasonic sounds.
Thank you. Next question.
I have a question. You pointed out, you said that that bounding box is a bit too short. And I was wondering if you ever looked into expert agreement concerning the size of your bounding boxes, but also for species recognition, because I suppose that people do not agree 100% either.
Indeed, yeah. Well, it just should be precisely at the beginning and at the end. That's how we actually annotated the bounding boxes. And this, I think the social call was a bit too wide in our results.
But did you have like several, like 10 people annotate the same
Not,
because then you would know how far your offset is
yeah.
between people, and that kind of like determines on how accurate your model also may be read.
Yeah, we had several people, but yeah, we tried to make the rules for annotation as clear as possible to avoid such problems.
It'd be interesting to quantify
Yes.
for a couple examples.
If there are no other questions, I'd like to thank Marcus for this excellent first talk.